Thank you, Mohit. So, as Mohit mentioned, my name is Angelique Medina. I work at a company called Thousand Eyes. And in 2015, based on the requests from some of our customers, we started to look at the comparative performance of public DNS resolvers. And since that time, we've expanded the scope of our research on DNS to include root server performance. We also looked at things like the DNS in China. And this year is a little bit different because we've actually updated our methodology and we've expanded some of the scope as well. And I'll touch on what that expanded scope looks like at the end of the session. So in terms of why we're looking at public DNS resolvers, for you folks here at NANOG, this will be pretty obvious. But it's always good to establish why you're doing something. So, it's fairly well known, and research has shown that a delay of even 250 milliseconds will be perceptible to users and will start to impact their performance. And DNS resolution as a component of that, there's really not a lot of margin there. So the fact that it affects user experience, as well as the fact that DNS resolvers are the choice of user, right? So they can use their default ISP's server settings, or they can use their local DNS resolver, or they may choose to use a public DNS resolver, and there's not a lot of information out there in terms of performance. So obviously you have Google, Quad 8, very well-known one, but there are a lot of other ones as well, including regional providers. So we'll look at those as well. The other reason that we're doing this research is we wanted to update it to include v6. There's not a lot of research done on performance of public resolvers when it comes to v6, so that's something that we wanted to look at. So in terms of other reasons that you might choose a resolver, we're not going to be touching on anything other than just performance, but there are obviously other reasons why you would choose a resolver. So privacy, security, ultimately it comes down to whether or not you actually trust the resolver operator with your queries. So obviously that's beyond the scope of this session today, and we're not really here to recommend or to kind of discuss what the right resolver is. It's really just to present our findings dispassionately and let folks decide what they want to do with the information. So in terms of the resolvers that we covered, we looked at 15 public resolvers. So we have the very kind of well-known names. So we have Google, OpenDNS that we looked at. There's also, very interestingly, several new entrants to the public DNS resolver space. So clean browsing is an obvious one. Also Cloudflare as well as Quad 9. So Cloudflare, obviously, they announced their service back in April. Quad 9 went out of beta at the end of last year, and then clean browsing was also added in the past 18 months. So we're excited to include those folks. We also look at regional providers like Yandex, and then some more obscure names like OpenNIC. So we have a pretty wide breadth of coverage here. So in the case where the provider supports v6, we also looked at that. So in terms of what we're actually measuring, we're looking at resolution time. And resolution time, the measurement that we're going to take, is really dependent on whether or not the query is in the resolver's cache. So, obviously that's not something that we directly can affect, but we've actually constructed our test in such a way to reduce the frequency that the public DNS resolver needs to query authoritative. So, a lot of these providers, they actually optimize their resolution time using techniques like prefetching from root and top-level domain. So it's very unlikely that our measurement would include iterative queries to those servers, but it's possible that it may include an iterative query to authoritative. So it just depends on whether or not it's in cache. And so if it is in cache, we're looking at the resolution, the network latency between the vantage point and the resolver, as well as DNS server processing time. And if it isn't in cache, then we would just look, the measurement would also include the iterative queries of the resolver. So in terms of our geographic scope, we have 252 vantage points and 58 vantage points for V6. So these are in data centers, they're managed, and this allows us to perform consistent measurement, and it's under our control. So in our previous methodology, we were using vantage points that we didn't manage, and they were principally connected to eyeball networks. And one of the reasons that we decided to change our methodology and use vantage points that we manage is because, one, the vantage points that we didn't manage, they didn't support V6, and we wanted to have a consistent way to measure V6 and V4 performance. The other reason is that anytime we were looking at measurements, we didn't really know what they meant, so we couldn't dig any deeper. We couldn't look at network connectivity, for instance. We couldn't tell how much of resolution time was due to network latency or to the DNS resolver's processing. So with these vantage points, we have the ability to actually look at network connectivity. So we can tell, for instance, if maybe we have an availability issue, what the root cause might be. Maybe it's an ISP that's dropping packets. And we can tell how much of resolution time is due to network latency. And just to kind of mention frequency, we're doing every 30 minutes, and this was over the course of 30 days that we tested. So in terms of the query, so we are querying for V4, example.com, the A record. And for V6, we're querying the quad A record of example.com. Now, obviously, the network protocol is independent of the query type, but that's the way that we chose to construct the test. And one of the reasons that we chose example.com is that it has a long TTL. And what that, the intent there was to reduce the frequency that the DNS resolver would need to query authoritative. So in doing that, we were hoping to primarily measure what was in the resolver's cache. Now, a lot of the resolvers choose to manage their cache differently. So for instance, Google, OpenDNS, Cloudflare, they will change the TTL value to some defined maximum. So in the case of Cloudflare, I think it's like 2 hours. OpenDNS, I think it's like 4, and Google has some number as well. It's definitely lower than 24 hours. But still, those are pretty significant windows. And if you're testing every 30 minutes, and then you take into account other users that are using that resolver, it's very likely that what you're measuring is actually a cache record. The other thing is, this is a recursive query, so the RD bit is enabled. So in terms of our performance findings, just to kind of as a side note here, the last time that we measured the public resolvers was back in July. And when we were doing that, we were using our previous methodology. And what's really interesting is that the findings that we have here are very similar to those in terms of the top 3. Obviously, there's going to be some movement because we've added some resolvers that we've never previously included as part of our research. But it was interesting to us that even though we're doing data center to data center tests in this particular round, the results are actually very similar to the results when we were using vantage points on eyeball networks. So in terms of the performance across regions. So what we're looking at here, we have a table. The columns are the various regions, and then the rows are the providers. And we have the colors correspond to percentiles. And this is resolution time, mean resolution time in milliseconds. So the first thing that you'll notice is that Cloudflare, Google, and OpenDNS really dominate across the board. And this was something we found in our last test. So very strong performance with very few exceptions. They are the top 3 across all regions. Some other interesting findings as well is that the new entrants like Clean Browsing and Quad 9 also very strong performers here. So that was good to see. The other thing, there's some regional providers, like if you look at, for instance, Yandex, they show reasonably well here. They're a Russia-focused resolver, and they're really like 1 or 2 in terms of performance for Russia. So they show really strongly for Europe, but not really anywhere else. And so, what it kind of shows you is that, in some cases, you'll see that some of these resolvers don't perform well outside of a particular region, and that may be intentional. They may not be trying to serve users outside of that region, and the data will just simply reflect that. So that was it was interesting to see. And then you see other folks like DNS Watch, which is based in Austria, also very good performance in Europe. And then, of course, like Level 3, their carrier, really only good performance in Europe and North America. So if we look at those, that data in just kind of zooming out and looking at just simply from a ranking standpoint. So we can see that Cloudflare is fairly strong in a lot of regions, but Google is strong in North America. And very often you're talking about just a few milliseconds difference here. So not to say that one is necessarily stronger than the other, because again, it's very close in terms of our findings. What was interesting, you see again, OpenDNS very strong. And then we see some of the new entrants that are popping into the top 5. So we have Clean Browsing, which is actually their focus is on being like a family-friendly DNS provider. So they're principally used by schools. They filter like adult content, and even some of their service tiers will filter things like Reddit. So it's very interesting, even just in the last year, how they've been able to, I think they're in like 20 POPs right now. They're going to be expanding to 28. Very good performance in a lot of regions. And then, Quad 9, obviously, they're making an appearance as well. So you can see here that, for instance, in North America and Europe, you see a lot of the providers that are all under 25 milliseconds. So when you start to look at regions like South America and Africa, you don't have a lot of choices. Number 5, Clean Browsing, is like above 100 milliseconds. Quad 9 in South America is above 100 milliseconds. So there are fewer choices when you start to get into some of these regions, in particular South Africa South America and Africa. Just a note in terms of Asia, we're actually excluding vantage points that are located in mainland China. So we actually are still taking measurements for those vantage points. We're just not including them in the aggregate ranking, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. But we do include those that are located in Hong Kong. So why are we excluding China? I mean, it's fairly well documented, and we've done some research on this as well in terms of how they use DNS proxies to interfere, block, redirect traffic. We've documented this looking at things like DNS cache poisoning. So even though the domain that we're resolving is fairly innocuous and it's not being redirected, or we're getting the return that we expect. The issue with China is that overall the performance is just really poor as a result of this interference. So, average latency across all other geos is around 68. That's even taking into account a lot of countries that just have really poor DNS performance, like Saudi Arabia, South America, but China is just, it's pretty extreme. The ones that are most impacted are ones like Cloudflare, and then going down the list. Google and Newstar, actually not terrible. Google in particular seems to at least be serviceable there. And it's interesting because we won't cover managed DNS providers today, but we found some really interesting findings with Google and their Google Cloud DNS in China. So just looking at performance over time for the top 3 providers. So Google was, there's a little bit of variation from test to test, but overall there wasn't any significant jumps or spikes in resolution time throughout our test period. Cloudflare seemed to be the most jumpy. both Cloudflare and OpenDNS had some pretty high resolution time spikes. So we're going to take a look at those in a little bit more detail, just in terms of what was causing them. So this took place on September 25th. So this is an example of several locations in Australia, New Jersey, and India. They suddenly had a really high spike in resolution time. And so looking at whether or not the network was at play here, I mean, given the geographic spread, it's not likely that it's a network issue. It's probably more likely an issue with the application, but we looked at network latency anyway, and what we found is that it was virtually the same before, during, and after this resolution spike. So we can see it's like less than a millisecond, in some cases 16 milliseconds in India, and you're looking at like almost 3 seconds. Basically it's like almost hitting timeout before we were getting a response. The other thing is, like we see in OpenDNS, this took place the next day, and that's a little bit more, some of the locations there, like they're on the East Coast, and then there's one in Chicago. They have a POP in Ashburn and a POP in Chicago, so it's unclear whether or not they're being served out of the same POP or not. But you see, actually, it's worse on the East Coast than it is in Chicago. But again, network latency didn't seem to be the factor here. You're looking at like very reasonable network latency measurements, with the exception of Indonesia, which is, that's probably, the root cause there is probably due to the network latency. So unclear what the cause of that was, but that's just something interesting to note. So in terms of our findings for v6, so what you'll notice right off the bat is that our list is a lot smaller than it was for v4. And also what we see is that there's a lot of the new DNS resolvers made our list. So Cloudflare, Clean Browsing, and Quad 9, the 3 newest entrants, are all on this list. It may be that they just decided to bake in v6, and that's why they perform really well. One thing that was really interesting to us is that Google really drops down for v6, particularly in Oceania, which is Australia, New Zealand, as well as in Africa, and we'll come back to that in a few slides. So, it seems like Cloudflare, OpenDNS, very strong across the board, and some unusually high resolution times for Google for v6. So again, coming to our rankings. So here we see Cloudflare pretty strong, Europe, North America, Oceania and Africa. In Asia and South America, OpenDNS goes to the top. And then Google drops down quite a bit for North America and Oceania, but in 5th place, they're in 5th place in North America, but their resolution time is still pretty decent. And then you contrast that with Oceania, in which it's like 130 milliseconds. So pretty broad spread across these rankings, which was interesting. I mean, in North America and Europe, generally speaking, the top 5 will be like in the 20 millisecond range. Going outside of those 2 regions, even sometimes your 3, 4, and 5 can be pretty poor. So there's often just like a couple of really good performers in those regions. So looking more closely at performance over time for them, so we can see Google, yes, there's some variation over time, but Cloudflare actually has some spikiness, again, similar to what we saw with v4. So, it's a fairly new service, unclear what's causing these brief jumps in resolution time, but we saw this with v4 as well. So in terms of the comparison of v4 and v6, especially with the top 5, so looking at Cloudflare, OpenDNS, Quad 9, Clean Browsing, v4 and v6 are pretty much on par in terms of performance. The biggest discrepancy, at least in terms of the top providers, is Google. That was something that was surprising to us, and we thought maybe it was due to maybe they didn't have as much coverage for v6. Maybe the queries that we were sending had to go to a POP that was further away from the vantage point. So that's something we wanted to dig into. So This is a bit of an eye chart. So if you just look first at the large chart, so this is IPv6 connectivity to Google's DNS service. So here we can see that it's really just in Africa and in Oceania that we have this really big discrepancy between network latency and resolution time. So that wasn't something we were expecting to see because we thought maybe that it was network latency that it was contributing to that higher resolution time. And that wasn't the case. So if you look, for instance, in the top left-hand chart, you'll see the same, we're looking at just locations that for v4 that also have a location for v6. So we're just looking at 58 locations for v4, so we're kind of like looking apples to apples. And it's the same issue in South America and, in Oceania and in Africa, it's just not as severe. So the network latencies are pretty much even for v4 and for v6. We just have this very high resolution time for v6. So, again, you can kind of see in the bottom left-hand chart, we're just looking at network latency. In the problem regions for v6 in Africa and in Oceania, you'll see that network latency is actually pretty much the same for v4 and v6, which was really surprising to us. So looking at a little bit more closely at the hops from our vantage point and to Google's DNS service, there's not that much additional time that it's taking or that many more hops that it's taking to get the query resolved. So this seems to be an issue with, it's unclear what the issue is, except that we know that it's not network latency, and that it appears that they're actually serving the v6 DNS service is available in similar locations as v4. So in terms of availability, availability is pretty good. So across the board, like greater than 99% for all the providers, as you would expect. There's a few anomalies here, though. So one of them is Cloudflare's v4, and the other is Google's v6 DNS service. So kind of quickly going through Cloudflare one, because this one's probably familiar to everyone. They rolled out earlier this year. At the time that they announced their service, they talked a little bit about some of the challenges that they had in sort of readying for kind of the use of Quad 1. There was a lot of ISPs and vendors who were abusing the Quad 1 IP address, and they had done some work in advance of the announcement of their service to try to improve availability. But they're still seeing some issues, and we saw this in the tests that we did. So there were a number of vantage points that either throughout the entire test period or through different points in the test period were just simply not able to reach Quad 1. So this is an example. There was a vantage point that was in Guadalajara, and all the traffic that was destined for Quad 1 was getting dropped in an ISP. And we saw this again in Madrid. In that instance, at no point during our testing period what were they able to reach Cloudflare. Everything was getting dropped. The good news is, if you're interested in using Cloudflare, that 1.0.0.1 has virtually identical performance. So that's obviously a good option. The other one was Google's v6 DNS service. So I'm not going to add a lot of commentary to this one because I'm sure you guys are aware of the issue here. There's plenty of material even on the NANOG mailing list about this going back to 2016. This is not something that's isolated to Google's IPv6 DNS service. This is just v6 overall. Cogent, anything destined for Google connecting via IPv6 is just simply dropped. So there's just chalk it up to the vagaries of internet routing. It's a long-standing issue, and it's just something that we noticed during our test, and that's what's contributing to the low availability. So in terms of the summation here, looking at the overall rankings for v4 and v6. So again, top 3, Cloudflare, OpenDNS, Google, really great performance. And then Quad 9, which is fairly new here. They announced last year, I think they have 128 POPs, and they're expecting to add additional POPs to get to 150 by the end of the year. So it's going to be interesting to see these results next year because we expect things to move around. And then for v6, what was interesting is that we had a little bit of shifting. Google dropped down to number 3. Quad 9, again, really strong performance. And then another new entrant, Clean Browsing, which again is really just focused on like filtering and schools and being kind of a family-friendly browser. They actually perform really well across the board. So there's obviously some differences in countries. We've also collected information for very granular for different countries that we don't have time to get into here. But we will be producing and putting out this more comprehensive DNS performance report, which will include not only very granular information that we collected for the DNS resolvers, but also we'll look at root server performance and just some of the trends associated with the managed DNS providers across different regions and some of the highlights there. So that's going to be coming out next week. We're always looking for input and feedback on what we can improve, what we can continue, maybe add. So feel free to reach out to me, and you can follow me on Twitter as well. So any questions?
Probably have a couple minutes for 1 or 2 minutes for a quick question or two if there are questions. All right, well, let's, do you have a question? Yeah, go for it. Take one question.
Hi, Hugo from Demonware. I just had a quick question on the network latency compared to the DNS resolution latency.
Yes.
What were you using for latency measurements? Was that ICMP or were you doing like TCP traceroute type?
We were doing, yes, we were using TCP, so okay. TCP-based traceroute.
Cool,
yes.
cheers, thanks.
Something similar to that.
All right, well, let's thank Angelique for the talk.